Good evening, everyone. Welcome. This is the second webinar of our Fall 2024 series, which is our fifth year of doing this. We're so excited. Webinars, as you know, presented by Newton Conservators. My name's Beth Wilkinson, and I will be your host for this evening. Barbara Bates is our technical director. And Newton Conservators, as many of you know, is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961 that connects people to open space and works to preserve that open space. We are grateful for the beauty and sustenance that the land provides for humans and the other creatures with whom we share the earth. We acknowledge the Massachusetts stewardship of this land that kept its ecological communities vibrant and strong and interconnected for thousands of years. Tonight's presentation is by Dr. Avalon Owens, who will explain that although light pollution interferes with the development, movement, foraging, courtship, and reproduction of diverse insect species, it can be cheaply, easily, and instantly eliminated. Such good news. Dr. Owens is a research fellow at the Rowland Institute at Harvard. Her research group studies the impact of light pollution on organisms and ecosystems with a focus on firefly conservation and moth evolution, which would be really neat to hear about too. Avalon holds a BA in Integrative Biology from Harvard, an MS in Entomology from National Taiwan University, and a Ph.D. in Biology from Tufts. We're really fortunate that she'll share her knowledge and advice with us tonight. Welcome, Avalon.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm so happy to be here. This is such a special opportunity to get to talk to you all about something that is really important to me and is also highly local. So I hope some of the things I talk about today connect to your life, connect to what's going on in Newton, and that we have a good discussion afterwards. So let me start at the beginning. Light is the source of all life on Earth. It's a major way in which most animals experience their environment, and it's a reliable signal of passing time that has been constant for all of evolutionary history until now. We are rapidly and radically changing the way that our world looks at night. And by studying this, I hope to gain insight into what is going to happen in the future. So I want to start today with hopefully the most important takeaway that I want you guys to come away from this with, namely two very spooky statistics. The first is that over half of the US is unnaturally bright at night. Over half of the land surface of the US, it looks a lot different than it used to. Not only that, but the night has become twice as bright in just the past decade on average because of the proliferation of artificial lights everywhere as a result of technological development and a bunch of other things. This problem is not only hugely widespread, it's also accelerating rapidly. But this is sort of abstract, right? So I want to think about what this looks like on a local level. So this is an image of Alewife Brook Pathway. This is right by my house. I love to go on walks here. And I love it because it's such a beautiful natural area, right? It's very green. You've got all sorts of animals and plants living together in harmony. And I think many people look at this place as somewhere that is pristine. It is sort of the goal of what we want to achieve in our cities, right? This pristine bit of habitat. And we think, you know, how nice is this? And then we go home at night and we close our curtains and we don't think about what happens next, which is that at night, this reservation is heavily light polluted. There aren't lights in the reserve itself, but they're coming in from these neighboring developments. And this photo really understates it. I mean, it's so noticeable when you're there at night, just how bright these LEDs are shining through these big glass windows of the buildings nearby. So another thing to take away from this is a greater appreciation for the fact that the parks that we walk through, our gardens, our neighborhoods, they all look very different at night. And it's a startling difference. So I'm an entomologist. I study insects, not only because I like them, but also because they're very important for the functioning of ecosystems. They're sort of the foundation of our food webs. And we are, this is a splash image, let me say. So this is from a paper about insect conservation that came out a few years ago. And so there's lots of images like this in the insect conservation space. It's just supposed to give you an appreciation for the diversity of insects that there are on this earth. And it's lovely to look at, right? And I think a lot of us, we can pick out many that are familiar to us. So it might surprise you to learn that of the insects shown in this general picture of insect diversity, only 3 of them are nocturnal. The other ones are ones that you're going to see flying around during the day. Only 3, the Luna moth, the firefly, and this stonefly there, come out at night. Well, you might think, sure, I mean, there probably aren't that many nocturnal insects. I never see them. But of course, we're hugely biased in this, right? And it turns out that 60% of insects are mostly active at night. So images like this really give a very skewed perspective on what's going on. Most insect activity of interest is happening at night, and it's happening at a time when the habitat is super degraded because of all this artificial light. So these are important things to talk about. This is, a highly relevant subject. Why do we care what's happening to the insects? I mentioned they're the foundation of our food webs. One of the ways in which this manifests is they are pollinators of our plants. The food that we eat, a lot of it has been touched by an insect in one way or another. And these plant-insect interactions are really important for keeping us alive and for keeping the ecosystem functioning. Now, it may not surprise you now to learn that the insects that pollinate our plants during the day get most of the credit for pollination. So when we think of pollination, we think of a butterfly, a bee, maybe a hoverfly, if we've really been paying attention. And we're not at all thinking about what the moths are doing at night because we don't see them. But moths are doing a lot of the pollination in our gardens and elsewhere. And here's some images of my backyard garden. I'm not much of a gardener, but I do have some friends that are into native plants. And so I do my best to plant what they tell me and watch it grow. And I've been really interested to see the visitors to my flowers. Not only do we have a moth here, this is a day active moth, but it's a start, right? Visiting the milkweed. But if you go out a little bit later at night, you might see a moth like this hanging out on the milkweed, or a moth like this. And here's a moth on, I believe this is bee balm, not a native plant expert, but I think so. And you can see it's doing a lot of pollinating. In fact, it seems to be a pretty good pollinator because it's big, it's fuzzy, and it's really vibrating the flowers with all of its wing beats. In fact, I would venture to say that moths are much better pollinators than the butterflies that normally get credit for it. Butterflies are often perched pretty far away from the important stuff in the flower. And so moths are really the unsung heroes of pollination. That's another takeaway I would like you to come away from this talk with. Moths are also beautiful, diverse, stunning to look at. Once you start thinking about them and looking a little closer at them, you'll go absolutely wild for moths, at which point you might be interested in joining the Mass Moths Project. This state has a very beautiful community science project all about observing the moths of Massachusetts, and there's lots of records to look at, species accounts, and a lot to learn. There's a really active group of normally called mothers, although moths are also in the order Lepidoptera. It's the entomology term. And so I heard somebody say recently that they're a leper, which I thought was pretty good. But anyway, so how do you go out and see these moths if you want to get into this? Well, you're probably going to end up at a light of one form or another. So on the left is an image of a light sheet that people in the Athelberta Nature Club are using to see the moths in the area who are attracted to the light. And people have been doing this in one way or another for decades now. A lot of scientists will use light traps as a survey method. And so, I mean, this on the left this is pretty fun. It's a pretty fun thing to do. However, it really has to be the right place and time, because more and more frequently, it seems like when we put up sheets, when we put up sheets, we don't get much at all. It's actually, a lot of people come into this thinking it's going to be amazing. And if you put up a moth sheet in an urban area, it can be pretty disappointing. So that's concerning, right? What's going on there? Well, even more concerning is these scientific light traps that we're using to catch moths are also not getting as many as they used to. And in fact, these data are from the largest moth monitoring network around. It's been running since 1968 in Great Britain. And they've found over the course of the last 50 years, really significant declines in the number of moths that they're catching. This is one of many examples of scientific data showing a great decline in insect abundance and diversity. And you might have seen this culminate a few years ago in what we call the insect apocalypse, which is a general feeling with some amount of scientific support that insect populations are rapidly declining in a sort of unexplained and very frightening way. As you can see, it can be a little hyperbolic, but certainly something seems to be going on because we just don't see as many around as we used to. One hint as to what is going on is that nocturnal moths, or moths that are sort of active both during the day and at night, are declining a lot more than day active butterflies. And similarly, moths and butterflies that are attracted to lights seem to be declining more than ones that don't come to lights. This is only a single study. It's out of the Netherlands, but I find this one very, very interesting because it's really pointing at nocturnal insects being especially at risk of decline due to some unknown human pressure. What might that be? Well, we've spent a lot of time as entomologists pontificating upon this, and probably there's a lot of stuff going on. So certainly pesticides are very bad for insects. Drought is very bad for insects. Extreme weather events like fires, hurricanes, etc., are pretty bad for insects. And there's a couple other things as well. Industrialization. This is a splash image from a very nice paper by Dave Wagner at UConn all about this. And something to notice here, once again, there are no nocturnal insects shown. So according to this splash image, insects comprise ants, caterpillars, bees, and butterflies. And maybe this caterpillar is nocturnal as an adult, but it's a bit of a stretch. So again, a little bit of a bias there. But what I'm more interested in is the fact that light pollution isn't shown here. And in fact, until quite recently, we weren't really talking about light pollution at all as a threat to insects, which makes me wonder, why not? You know, we talk about pesticides all the time. Climate change is another one. We talk about how climate change affects insects. How come light pollution never makes that list? So thinking through this, I came up with a couple possibilities. It might be that light pollution just isn't as widespread. So the insect apocalypse is supposed to be a global phenomenon. It's happening all around the world. And light pollution, some might say, it's just sort of an urbanization thing. You know, it's in cities. Cities are pretty bright. New York City, Boston, sure, but it's not a widespread problem, right? Of course, I disagree. But before I show you why, I want to do a little bit of background. So light pollution is a kind of a vague term. It means one of two things. So we have point sources of lights like street lights, windows, car headlights, billboards, and these are just individual lights that have this big impact on their immediate environment. So they illuminate this street, and sometimes they shine into the windows on this house here. When that light goes up into the sky or bounces off the ground and is reflected up, it turns into this haze, this sort of diffuse haze that we call sky glow. Sky glow is the reason that we can't see the stars at night in Cambridge and Arlington, and I'm going to guess Newton, although I technically haven't tried. So that's sort of light pollution as a haze, as a general phenomenon. And that haze can be detected for miles away. So you don't have to be in Boston to be affected by the lights from Boston. In fact, that light travels pretty far. And so we can use satellite imagery, like here on the right, to build models of how sky glow diffuses across the landscape, where it is, at what intensity. And that map looks pretty striking. So when I say over 50% of the US is artificially bright at night, this is what I mean. So the colors on that map correspond to various levels of sky glow here on the bottom, where black and gray are pristine, natural night skies. And then anything above here, especially in the yellow to red range, you're really having trouble seeing stars. And then the white is a total lost cause. So light pollution is hugely widespread. And the final thing I'll say about this is that even these models kind of underrepresent what's happening because they're built from satellite imagery, and satellites are looking down at the ground from space. They don't see a lot. They don't see, for example, the light from this house coming through the windows into the forest. That light's not going into space, and yet it's still radically transforming the habitat of these fireflies, which you can see sort of floating around. Just once more. So this was taken in Lincoln, right down the road, and you can actually see two species of fireflies here. There's one that does a flash, 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 a triple flash, and then there's one that just does a little single guy. The flash patterns are particular to the species. We'll talk about this later. So is it that light pollution isn't widespread enough to be an issue? Absolutely not. Okay, well, maybe it's not pervasive enough. And what I mean by that is it's not getting into natural areas, because the insect apocalypse is supposed to be both a global phenomenon and one that is present in places that you wouldn't expect. So not only are insects declining in cities, they're declining in nature reserves. There's two studies, one out of Germany and one out of Puerto Rico, that see these big declines in reserves. So reserves must mean there's no light pollution if it's a reserve, right? Well, unfortunately not. So here's an example. This is one of the sites in Germany that was included in that very scary study I alluded to, where you have this beautiful natural area. There's a trap they use to get the insects. And much like the Alewife Brook pathway, it looks perfectly nice, but at night, it's one of these points on this light pollution map. You can see it is actually pretty light polluted. There might not be lights in the exact area, but they're leaking in from around side. And what that looks like on the ground is something like this. So this is an image of the night sky at Chaco Culture National Historic Park in New Mexico. And this is a reserve that the Park Service has put a lot of effort into protecting the night sky as a cultural artifact, something of cultural value to the Native Americans who once lived there and still live there. And so there's no lights inside the reserve, and you can get this beautiful, this is a false color image of the night sky. You can see the Milky Way really clearly. And if you take all of that natural light from the stars and the Milky Way, if you remove that, you can see there's actually a lot of artificial light as well on the horizon that's coming in from far away. Even though there's no lights in the reserve, it's still pretty light polluted. And this image I find very striking because from a cultural perspective, looking at the night sky, it's sort of the foundation of the human science, the study of our place in the universe. It's sort of how science got started. And it's also a way for us as humans to feel small in the grand scheme of things, right? Except that in this case, the Milky Way is just as bright as Albuquerque, which doesn't make one feel very small. It makes humans seem pretty impactful, actually. And the last thing I'll say about this is, so I've just mentioned sky glow coming from cities, which reinforces this idea that light pollution is an urbanization thing. But that's not really true either, because there's lots of other infrastructure that has lights on it in natural areas. So oil and gas drilling operations is one. Structures of like associated with national parks, like visitor centers, things like that. Vacation homes in the middle of Maine, those have a lot of lights on them. The US-Mexico border wall, at least for a while, and probably still, is heavily, heavily illuminated, even though there's nobody living there. So light pollution is certainly pervasive. Maybe the timeline isn't right. So the insect apocalypse, it's sort of a new-ish phenomenon. It's about the past 30 years or so that insects have declined to the point where people are really noticing. And so maybe light pollution is sort of doesn't have the right timeline. Maybe it started earlier because we've had lights for a while, right? So this is Boston Common at twilight. This was painted in 1886, and you can see Boston Common back then had a lot of lights. I mean, not a lot. So these are gas lamps around the perimeter of the park. But it's worth noting there aren't that many of them. They're not all that bright, and they would not have been on all night because it was very expensive. In contrast, Boston Common at twilight today looks something like this, where there's lights absolutely everywhere because lights are extremely cheap. LEDs especially are so cheap that in some cases, in fact, there's a school in Lincoln. I'm not exactly sure. I don't want to misrepresent the facts, but sometimes, so I won't throw anybody under the bus here, but sometimes it's true that installing motion detectors to turn a light on and off automatically in certain cases is more expensive than just leaving the light on all the time because LEDs are super energy efficient. And so while there is still an argument to be made that like cutting down lighting saves money, in some cases, it's not a huge difference. And the reason that we have so many lights today is because they're so cheap. And that's a recent development, a very recent development. So before the advent of LEDs, this is a paper from 2001 that modeled how light pollution had grown over the 20th century and how it might be next year. But we're already far past this because of the LED technology, the development of the technology and the adoption, such that, like I said previously, the night sky has become twice as bright in just the past decade. And the past decade is when we've had this LED streetlight conversion, an LED turnover. Okay. Well, so from everything I've said, hopefully you're thinking light pollution seems like pretty significant, but maybe the things that it does to insects in particular don't really matter. Maybe it's just not a big deal because otherwise wouldn't we be talking about it, right? So what does light pollution do to insects? How does it threaten them? This is a big topic, and it's one that I think about and talk about a lot. I've written probably too many papers at this point going over the various effects across the insect life cycle. And like, this figure is supposed to be overwhelming and confusing because there's a lot going on. But for today, I want to really simplify it down to three main things that light pollution does to insects. And these are all fairly different. So discussions of the ecological impacts of light pollution can rapidly become very confusing unless we sort of think about these separately. So please come along with me on this journey. So first of all, light pollution confuses an insect's sense of time. And also, let me say, I'm talking about insects for all of these, but a lot of them are more broadly applicable to animals more generally, and sometimes plants as well. But I have a big insect bias here. So light pollution interferes with an insect's perception of time. What does that look like? Insects, like other animals, do certain things at certain times of day. And nocturnal insects, like this moth, will come out at night at a certain time to perform their important activities: foraging, mating, laying eggs, etc. And so in this case, this moth is drinking nectar from this flower. The flower might not open until a particular time, and so the time that the moth is active, these things are matched. And the moth uses the external light environment as a cue in deciding when to become active, right? Just like we wake up when the sun comes up, the moth wakes up when the sun goes down. And if the moth wakes up, but there's a bunch of light around, a street light or whatever, it might think to itself, okay, well, time to go back to sleep. I'm a little too early. I'll wait until it gets dark. And sometimes it never gets dark. In fact, we use this intentionally as a form of pest control. So some greenhouses will leave lights on all night, specifically so that nocturnal insects don't eat the plants, because the nocturnal insects won't be eating anything. They're just going to be sitting around waiting for it to get dark. So this is interference with daily timings. There's also annual timing. So things happen at certain times of year, as I'm sure we're all aware now that the days are getting shorter and shorter and it's getting harder and harder to go into work. There's a rhythm to these things, and insects are no different. Neither are plants. Plants are a good example to talk about this. So I'm going to take a little bit of a sidebar here. So in 1936, this man noticed, I think he was the first one, that when he walked around New York City and looked at the trees, a lot of them had parts of them where they still had their leaves. So this is in probably November around this time. And in fact, you can go around later this week and try to see if you can see the same thing yourself, where parts of the trees still have their leaves, and those parts are closest to the streetlight. So the streetlight is right here next to the tree. I should have included some of my own photos because I now look out for this everywhere, and this is really the time to see it. It's quite common for trees to retain their leaves in the area that's illuminated by a streetlight, because, you know, according to that part of the tree, it's not winter yet because the days are still really long, right? The tree knows when to drop its leaves by looking at how long the day is. When the days get short, it prepares for winter. When the streetlight's there, it looks like it's still summer. Even if it gets really, really cold, the tree is not looking at how hot or cold it is. The tree is looking at the light environment. Insects work the same way. So insects need to prepare for the New England winter, and they do that by looking at how long the days are. When the days get short, they go into winter mode in advance of it getting cold. But the lights mess with this. And I don't have a picture of an insect, so let me show you another one of plants where this is late in the year. This is a soybean field. Most of these soybeans have sort of like senesced for the winter, but the ones right by this street light still think it's summer. They're still bright green and lush. And in fact, you can even see the shadow of the street light pole and the difference that makes. So a lot of plants and animals are really cued into these differences. They can have a big effect. Okay, that's one thing. Entirely separate from that, light can interfere with an insect's ability to navigate in space, to navigate. So a great example of this is the humble dung beetle. There are a lot of dung beetles in the US. You all might know more about them than me. The local guys, they're supposed to be in your yard helping you bury your dog poop, among other activities, although they are declining in a pretty scary way as it happens. And some dung beetles are capable of just incredible navigational feats. So the dung beetles have a goal. They'll happen upon some dung, they roll it into a ball, and what they want to do is lay their eggs in that dung and bury it so that their larvae can have a happy life growing until the next generation emerges. And so what they need to do is get away from the source of the dung as fast as possible. So they need to go in a straight line. That's all you really need to know about the system. So they need to go in a straight line because that's the most efficient way to go really quickly away from where you started. The way that they do this, though, is really amazing because a beetle that encounters a ball of dung, it will get on top of it and then turn a little circle. And what it's doing is looking up at the night sky and looking at the stars. And in this case, probably looking at the Milky Way. And the Milky Way becomes a landmark. So the simplest way to think of this is you look up, you find the Milky Way, and you can just follow it in a straight line to get where you're going really efficiently. So when dung beetles can see the Milky Way, they're really good at moving in a straight line. When they can't, when there's a lot of sky glow, they get really confused. And just like us, if you close your eyes and try to walk in a straight line, it's not going to go very well. They'll do the same thing. They'll sort of wander in circles. Also, though, if the lights of the city are visible sort of pretty close to them, sometimes they'll go straight towards it, which might be okay for the dung beetle because they're not going to reach a city that's very far away. But for a lot of insects that are right among lights, this can be very impactful as well. So I think this behavior, what we call flight to light behavior, is the first thing people think of when we talk about how light pollution affects insects. And it's certainly one of the biggest ways in which light pollution affects insects. So all sorts of insects, not just moths, all sorts of species will come to lights and circle them endlessly. This video is 10 hours long. It is slow motion, but not that slow motion. They'll do this forever. And that's not great, right? So one thing that often happens is that bats will come, bats or frogs, I've seen all sorts of things, will come to lights and use them as feeders, knowing that there's a bunch of insects there that they can eat. So the insects might die that way. They might die just from exhaustion. I mean, it's really exhausting to do this. They don't have a lot of calories. They're not supposed to live that long. And so they can just sort of exhaust themselves to death. They can also collide with the light source and injure themselves that way. So there's a lot of ways in which this can immediately result in the death of the insect. But also, it doesn't have to kill the insect to be bad for the insect, because as whenever insects are doing this, they're not doing the other important things: foraging, mating, laying eggs. And here's an example. These are mayflies, a mayfly swarm. These come out of the water. They do these big mating swarms, and then they are supposed to lay eggs in the water to start the next generation of mayflies. But instead, due to the lights and the way they're reflecting off this bridge, all of these mayflies are laying eggs on the bridge where they will die because their larvae are aquatic. So flight to light can have these huge impacts, can really decimate a population in this way. And the last thing I'll say about that is, for every insect that goes to a light that we know is being affected by the light, there's another insect that's going away from the light that's afraid of light. So the cave weta has been studied a little bit in New Zealand. These are an endangered insect that live in caves, and normally they leave the caves at night to forage. But when there's lights on, they are like, oh, this isn't for me. Maybe I'll wait until it gets dark. Maybe I'll just find somewhere dark. And so they don't end up doing the things that they need to do to survive. And last point here, a fun fact of the evening is that some crickets and katydids will do this interesting behavior called saluting, where when you take a photo of them with a camera flash, they'll hold up their front leg to block their eye. Just like you or I might want to shield our eyes from an LED headlight or a camera flash or any other bright light source. They too seem to be pretty sensitive and to find these lights very painful. Okay, and then the last thing that artificial light does to insects is a little confusing, appropriately enough. It just changes the way that things look. And insects use vision to navigate their environment. So as an example, a flower during the day looks like this. At night, in the eyes of a moth, it looks like this. When it's lit up by a cool white LED, it looks like this. And when it's lit up by an amber LED, it looks like this. So these things look radically different. And sure, we know that they're the same flower, but it can be pretty hard for an insect to tell. So this has all sorts of implications for plant-insect interactions, all that. But of course, we all know why we're here, which is that it also affects fireflies, which are insects that, well, first of all, they're amazing. And also, they are incredible flagship species for inspiring conservation, because everybody wants to have fireflies in their yard. because they do these magical displays where the male fireflies, here's one, will produce these strings of flashes, these flash patterns, and for good measure, let's just play, where is it? We'll just play that video one more time where you can see different flash patterns. All of these are produced by male fireflies floating around the habitat, doing this behavior. And the males are looking for a response. They're looking for an answer from a female firefly on the ground. We rarely see what this looks like, so here are some videos of it. So you see that blink, 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 blink? That's the male flash and the female response. So he'll do it again. Flash, flash, right? That's what we call a dialogue. The male is talking, the female's answering, and you can kind of see they're using this communication, this dialogue to find each other, to mate. When they mate, it looks like this. So this female has been marked with fluorescent powder. She's in green. Under her is a male. Those two are mating. And then there's this other male that's sort of hanging around and is hoping to get in on the action. He's probably thinking, if I just flash bright enough, maybe she'll pick me instead of him if I just walk all over her. He's not being very successful right now. If you're really lucky in the field, you might see something like this. This is what we call a triple stack. So there's a female firefly on the bottom. You can't even see her. And then there's a male on top of her mating, and then a male on top of him, and a male on top of him. And all three of them are attempting to mate with the female, only one of them successfully. So I hope you can get a sense that firefly courtship is not only dramatic, but it's also very visual, and it relies on these flashes, these visual cues. So under artificial light, this paradigm is pretty disruptive. So I'm going to show you another video of two fireflies dialoguing. So the male is on the top and the female is on the bottom. She's going to be right inside this circle is where you'll see her flash. See if this, yeah. So the male does 3 flashes and the female responds. He goes 1, 2, 3. She flashes back. 1, 2, 3. She flashes back. And now we turn on a light. Now the male's in the middle of the compartment and you can see him. He's walking along. 1, 2, 3, 4. He's doing a couple more flashes this time now, actually, as he goes. 1, 2, 3. Yeah, there's 3. And you might have looked to see if the female was responding. I'll let this play again. When it gets to the light part, you'll see, if you're paying attention, the female goes completely dark. So you won't see anything inside the circle. So he keeps flashing. She's there. And in fact, if you turn out the lights, she'll start answering him. But when the lights are on, she's totally uninterested. So statistically, that looks something like this, where in the dark, males flash around 10 times a minute, and females answer about 100% of the time. And when we turn on different colors of light overhead, the males flash about half as much. So they seem a little discouraged, but they're still trying. The females go totally dark. And that's huge because the females are the ones that decide whether or not this courtship is going to be successful, whether or not they're going to mate and lay eggs and have more fireflies in the next generation. So female fireflies are highly sensitive to artificial light. And that is why you shouldn't have lights in your backyard or front yard or any place that you'll want to see fireflies. Talk about that in a second. Another thing to notice here is that not all colors of light are as bad. I mean, they're all pretty bad, but it looks like dim blue and dim red light still let the females will still flash about half as much as in darkness, but they still will flash. They will dialogue. Amber, though, we'll talk about this. Amber's really impactful. It really is the worst for fireflies, actually, which isn't great, as we'll see. So that's sort of my summary of the impacts of artificial light on insects, really just scratching the surface. There's a lot there, but hopefully I can convince you that these are important things that we're talking about. They have a big impact. Which leads me back to my original question, why is it that we're not talking about light pollution? And I don't think it's any of these things. I think it's simply that we just don't see it. So like I was saying, talking about the Alewife Brook pathway, right? We know the natural spaces in our neighborhoods pretty well during the day. We know them in their daytime form. Oftentimes we don't see them at night. And it's not just, I'm talking about like scientists, the people who are supposed to like really be investigating what's going on. So as to be able to make good recommendations for conservation, we're not looking either, a lot of us. And so there's this huge bias against looking at these problems, which has really gotten in the way. Now, fortunately, I think it is changing, that we've had a lot of momentum in recent years around the question of light pollution as a driver of insect declines, as well as just as an environmental threat more generally. And there's a lot of momentum around dark sky conservation. So I know you guys had a talk recently about this, so I hope not to repeat too much. But there are some practical things that we can all do, practical recommendations that will improve our dark skies. And traditionally, they're sort of displayed like this. This is put out by Dark Sky International, which is the group working to preserve dark skies. And it says, the first thing you do is you shield your light so they're only pointing where you need them. And then you filter them so that they're warm. A warm white or even an amber color is what they recommend. And then you dim them, and then you can put them on timers or motion activators. And these recommendations came from astronomers. Dark Sky International started as a group of astronomers, and so they're all focused on night sky visibility, in particular, telescope observations, things like that. Fortunately, most of these recommendations also help the environment, so they're also ecologically friendly, but sometimes the focus is a little different. I just want to emphasize that. So the astronomy recommendations from Dark Sky International at the local level, Dark Sky Massachusetts integrates these, and on their website, they have a bunch of helpful resources for more local light pollution advocacy, looking at local regulations. And I was doing some reading earlier about what's going on in Newton, and you guys have some pretty good regulations, is my understanding. I do wonder how enforcement is. Maybe we can talk about that afterwards. But yeah, there's a lot of helpful stuff here. And you may also have heard that recently this has been pushed up to the state level, and Dark Sky Massachusetts is trying very hard to get a dark sky bill passed. And it's been a little discouraging, I gotta say, but we're doing our best. And the things that it's proposing are really sort of low-hanging fruit: shielding, color temperature, and so forth. The only thing I really have to add to this conversation is that the focus on shielding feels very astronomical to me, because of course a shielded light still affects the stuff on the ground beneath it, and that's what I'm interested in. The focus on color temperature is also pretty astronomical. So blue light creates more sky glow, which is why these groups promote warm white light or amber light. But as I showed earlier, amber light in particular is very bad for fireflies, because fireflies are kind of yellow-green, right? Amber light is kind of yellow. There's a lot of overlap there. It makes it hard for them to see each other. And in general, the vision, like, some people think if I can just find the right color of light, then it won't affect the animals, and then I can use it as much as I want. But of course, that's not how things work, because animals are incredibly diverse, and the ways that they see, the colors that they see are really diverse. So there is no solution that's going to only let humans see and not other animals. And I think that focusing on color, it has other benefits, and I think it really motivates people to get engaged locally, because it has such a big impact on the aesthetics of your town. And it does also have an impact on sky glow and star visibility. But as far as ecology goes, I'm not convinced that it's really useful. And in fact, sometimes I think it's not helpful to think too much about color, because you're at risk of saying, well, if I have warm white lights, then my lights are good and I can use as much of them as I want. And that's not really how it works. So I worked with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation to come up with a set of firefly-friendly lighting guidelines that de-emphasize color. Yeah, I think focusing on color is not ideal. I want practical guidelines that are like really focused on what's good for the animals. So moving away from this color thing, and I will put a link in the chat to the Firefly Friendly Lighting Guidelines PDF. But here for you all is my most updated take on all of this, which is that the number one thing that we should be doing is removing lights that aren't necessary. And that is what we call aesthetic lighting, house lights that illuminate facades, lights that illuminate trees, string lights, lights that people aren't using. Like if you want to have a backyard event and put up some string lights, go for it. I think that's as nice as anybody. But if you're not using your backyard, turn the string lights off, right? And whatever light is going on in this photo is a great example of a light that is completely unnecessary. It's better to just be in the dark and appreciate the night sky, right? So that's number one. And then number two, the absolute best thing that you can do to reduce light pollution is put on a motion activator. Most animals won't activate them. Humans will activate them. So when humans are outside using the space is lit. When we go to bed, it's dark. Boom, problem solved. This plus curtains will fix everything. But if you have to have lights on, then we start talking about shielding to make sure they're on a sidewalk and not a yard, dimming them so they're only as bright as you need to navigate. This one's a little tricky because dim to us is not dim to most insects. Their eyes are thousands of times more sensitive than our own, so it's never really going to be dim enough, which is why I rank this sort of low as far as priority goes. I just gave my thing about color. I do generally think that redder is better, but it becomes a human behavior thing at some point because people don't want red lights lighting up their neighborhoods. And again, I think it's a distraction from the more practical solutions. And then finally, automatic timers can have some use. We have some in Cambridge that dim lights by half at I think 11 p.m. And that's certainly reducing the amount of light going into the sky, and it's reducing energy costs somewhat. I think most of the interesting insect activity has already happened by 11 p.m. Not only that, but the dim setting is still pretty bright. So those top two are the final takeaway from today is that we really want to focus on removing unnecessary lights and motion activators as the gold standard. And with that, I have a lot of people to thank. And I also want to thank you all for listening. And I think we still have some time for questions. So I'm happy.
Absolutely do. Thank you. As I said, that was totally captivating. It's amazing. I loved your intro too, where you talked about the importance of light to humans and then put it in the context of the insects. Thank you. And it was really helpful for us, having just heard some information, a number of us, from an astronomer, to hear the difference for insects. I mean, those are critical differences for us. So thank you. Let's go to questions. If the audience members have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I will ask a couple. There was one word that stood out to me in the list you just gave us, and you mentioned curtains. And we don't hear about that a lot. And Russ Cohen, who wanted to be here tonight, sent me a message saying to be sure to ask you to bring up the issue that there's spillage, there's leakage from inside our houses that we don't think of outside. So can you say a couple words about that for us?
Absolutely, I would be so happy to. So I also started the talk with that image of Alewife Brook, right? And most of the light pollution there is coming from inside the buildings with these big glass windows. This is a huge thing, super common. Contemporary architecture is all about the window. And for whatever reason, curtains seem to have fallen out of fashion because it is wild if you walk around at night how much light is coming from windows. And that's really hard to regulate, right? Because you can't tell your neighbor to turn off their lights I mean, you can, but they probably won't like you very much. So we need to return to the good old days when I was growing up and my mom told me to close the blinds when I went to bed. This is something I of course think about a lot and do now, but I could see how if you're not thinking about it, it's easy to forget. And so my plan to become a millionaire and save the world is to invent smart curtains that close automatically
Oh,
after the sun goes down so that we can all not think about this. Because nobody is like, oh, I want my curtain to be open. Like, of
right.
course not.
Yep.
So it's just an awareness thing. Yeah.
And they're very popular, some that are translucent that keep people from seeing in, but it still doesn't necessarily keep all the light in. I,
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I use blackout curtains, and there's a benefit there as well, which is that if you have a lot of street lights and you want to get sleep, a blackout curtain doesn't let the light in as well as not out. So yeah, hopefully we can move towards that.
Terrific. Anne asks us, she said it's more a comment, that she sees more and more houses in Newton with home walkway lights and other unnecessary lighting, and that seems to be increasing, not decreasing.
Yep, for sure. I think one thing I see a lot these days are those solar lights, which save a lot of energy, right? You don't have to hook them up to anything. And therefore they are really easy to forget about. And so you'll see people like line their pathways with them. Um, yeah, this really gets me because like I said, I think it's lovely to decorate your yard with light if you're going to be using it, but there is no point in lighting up a pathway that you're for to make it pretty if nobody's going to be appreciating it. And for these sorts of things, I think opening up a healthy community dialogue and getting to know your neighbors and like approaching this in a sort of personal way can be really effective because I think most people who decorate their yard with lights, they love their yard, they love their garden, they think, they want to have this beautiful natural space. And there's other ways to get that, right? And so a little education can go a long way in that regard. But I definitely think this is increasing rather than decreasing. If you really want to get mad, you can go on Google and look at landscaping or there's certain words for it, like house light landscaping before after, where the after photos are always ridiculously overlit. They put the lights on trees. Why do you have to light up a tree and on walls and stuff? And it is trendy, and it's able to be trendy because it's cheap, but no, it's not good.
I have two neighbors who've just put in bright lighting, and I've decided my solution is for those of you, an announcement that I'll send out in a message tomorrow. Avalon has given us permission to record this, so we're recording it. And I am going to make once it's ready, I'm going to make a little brochure with a little description of it and a link to the YouTube video and talk and just say, you might want to know about the dangers of night light. So there are many ways we can continue to spread the word after this event.
Absolutely. And I think you can be perfectly friendly about it because, again, these people aren't malicious, and they're not light pollution denialists who living in an alternate reality, right? It's just something that you don't think about. And so if you can point it out, a lot of people are really open to learning more and to even changing their behavior a little.
Yep. And sometimes it's hard. I live right in the middle of Newton Center near a church, and they have several buildings, and they have very bright lights that shine all over. And I wrote to them and said, could you please dim these or turn them off? And the answer was no, no, they
Yeah.
couldn't. So it's a tough issue, and I think it is hard. Someone says, what can we do about our streetlights?
Great question. So the streetlight regulation is really at the town level. And I was reading a little bit about this just earlier today on the Dark Sky Massachusetts website. So I would go there first because I love lighting policy, but I'm not a policy expert. And uh, I don't have access to what's going on at the town level. But what I do know is that the people in Dark Sky Massachusetts are really active, really engaged, and are getting a lot done to change streetlights in their towns. And often this involves working with the energy companies, and there can be a little bit of tension there because obviously they want to sell you more light so they make more money. But if people group together, form coalitions, this is how change happens. And the Dark Sky Massachusetts chapter, they have a Google group with posts every so
Yeah.
often. They have weekly meetings. They have an in-person annual meeting. There's a lot that you can learn and great ways to get engaged there. So that was what I would recommend.
I don't remember the number well, but I think Newton street lights are 4,000. Is that a unit that
Kelvin, yeah.
yep. And so I guess that's higher than is recommended.
That's
So
pretty blue. Yeah, that's probably not very nice to look at.
so a number of us have thought that we would get together, and this audience would be perfect to work with us if people are interested. When you take a survey at the end, make a note to start talking to our city elected officials about what we can do to dim our streetlights.
I feel like I've actually heard about this with the Newton streetlight transition. I feel like I was around when it happened and it was quite startling. There was like a lot
Yes.
of pushback. And so the people at Dark Sky, Massachusetts would definitely know more. I think there's a lot that could be done there.
But you, from what you say, we need to work more in our own yards and limiting the light that we have for the insects in our own yards. Is
And
it
also you can serve as a model for your neighbors, right? And this is like the grassroots thing is really powerful. And neighborly conversation, community dialogue. I'm totally all about this now. I feel like we've kind of lost that a little bit. You know, people tend to be pretty isolated these days, but that community is really important.
so? Is it like, when planting native plants, there's a sense that if we string all of us together to make what's the word? Alan, you're here, to make a pathway, an interconnected
Yes.
stretch
100.
of native plants. Is that the same with darkness? That the more we can get us groups of us together, so we will make a bigger ecosystem even within our small communities?
100%. And I think with fireflies, that's like a really powerful thing because fireflies are super local. The fireflies that you see in your yard live there and they're living there generation after generation after generation. They don't move very far. And so if you have fireflies and your neighbor doesn't, but you have this nice dark pathway, you know, then you can get a little bit of spread on the neighborhood scale. So absolutely, I think the same principle applies. And the more we can link these beneficial spaces together, the better it is for insects.
Okay. Someone says that streetlights are installed to deter crime, so its elimination will be a hard sell.
Thank you for mentioning the safety thing. Yes, a lot to say there. I think so. There's streetlights. I'll get to that in a second. Security lights on houses. So if you talk to your neighbors about their lights, if they're security lights, that's when people get mad. And they're like, yeah, you don't have the right to tell me how to light my house. Although I think there is some stuff in the Newton light pollution ordinance that's about trespass. So I think actually you do
Yes.
have a bit of a, yeah.
Yeah.
But anyway, people get really mad about this. And I think motion detectors are an obvious win-win solution because they turn on when the bad guys are around, right?
Yep.
And they're even better than street lights, or sorry, security lights that are continuously operating because those create these bright spots and these dark shadows, and you can have people hide in the dark shadows, right? But if a person walks up to your house and is lit up, everybody knows that they're there. So it's actually a really powerful device for safety that also cuts back on light pollution. Now, streetlights are they are for safety. It's mostly driver and pedestrian safety is I would say the primary reason that we have streetlights, and then sort of other crime, of course, is also like considered. So that is important, and I think we don't need to fight that battle right now. Is sort of my thinking on this. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit, curtains being a big one, right? That can be more easily changed. But
Great.
I like to envision a better future in which streetlights are also on motion detectors linked up with smart
Oh,
technology. And also, this beautiful future might involve driverless cars that use radar and don't have lights at all. Why do we need lights if we're not, you know, driving vehicles at 30 miles an hour, right? So I think there are technological solutions that can really solve this problem, but it does require people to engage a little bit with the idea of, you know, enjoying a space at night without a bunch of light, which might feel a little uncomfortable. you do learn to love it, though, I would say. But again, that's like a touchy subject, and so it's a low priority, I think.
So if we want to go out walking at night and we want to bring a flashlight with us, um, when we went to do our observation in Cold Spring Park, we all brought red flashlights. Are those good for insects? Not
Yeah,
really. From
the redder the better. So most insects don't have red photoreceptors, which what that means is, so like we have red, green, and blue cones, which let us see color. They don't have the red one. And so they don't see red as red, but a lot of people take this to mean they cannot see red light, and it's not quite the same thing. They can still see it, it just looks dimmer to them.
okay.
Yeah. And so it's like, so red lights are good because they're going to appear dimmer. But they're not this perfect solution that you can now use as much as you want because you found the right color. That idea is not so great, that one. So I still recommend red lights for that kind of thing. And a flashlight as well is the ultimate environmentally friendly lighting method because it's on when you need it and off when you don't.
So when we go walking our dogs, we should go with
Yeah,
red flashlights.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And we do have a question if that they sell filters to help change the color of lights, a cover.
Yes,
And so this person said, are those effective? And are they
yes.
available?
I think so. If you, hopefully we're going to send out a link to my Firefly friendly lighting guidelines because
Yep,
I
they
hear
are.
you say this. I think this idea that you need to now buy a new light bulb is like it's a little consumerist, and of course the lighting companies get really excited to sell you more and more bulbs, but yeah, they make these things called gel filters for photography. You can just Google it on Amazon. They're super cheap, and they're meant to be put over lights to change their color, and they're like plastic, so you can cut them and like tape them and instantly have the light be whatever color you want. So for firefly walks, I usually bring a lot of these, and people can put them over their phone lights and then use their phone light to get around, or over a flashlight and a house light. You can do that as well. Yeah. If it's like a really, really big, really hot light, you might want a slightly better one just in case it melts. But most of your house lights, if they're LEDs, that probably won't be a problem.
Okay. William asks, he says he's not from Newton and he's active in the Somerville Garden Club. Will we be sending the link from the YouTube recording to attendees? Yes, absolutely. Everyone here and some people who signed up and are not here, will first of all get a letter from me tomorrow that will have the link to Avalon's recommendations for us. And then we have Ted Kuklinski is a wonderful person who edits our recordings, and it takes him sometimes a couple weeks because he's busy, but when they're done, then I will send out another link to the recording to everybody. So absolutely. Let's see what else.
I see. I'm gonna.
Someone noted that curtains also will add to aid with energy conservation. So we can do two things with one. Thomas says public parking has tons of nighttime lights. Seems unnecessary except to create a feeling of safety. This seems a terrible trend, if it is a trend.
Yes, I so when I started doing firefly research around here, I've done a little bit at Drumlin Farm in Lincoln. I love them. They're amazing. And when I started, they had just put in these new street lights all over their parking lot, and they were probably 4,000 Kelvin. They were very blue, they were very bright, and they were on. The parking lot's empty, everybody's gone home. It's like a real waste. Uh, that is pretty common, and it was hard to see. And you could tell because you could tell that the fireflies were sort of pushed away from the parking lot into sort of the more shadowy areas. And then, as I recall, at one point, a couple of them broke, and whoever was in charge just, I'm not exactly sure what happened, but they haven't been on lately. And guess what? It's exactly the same. And it's pretty nice, actually, to have it be dark. So, once again, if this is, an area where people are concerned about crime, motion detectors, There's no reason a street light can't have a motion detector. Some of them do, although it's not as common right now, but I feel like that's where we're going, and that would solve this problem.
There have been some field lights put in Newton, and the new field lights. We have a wonderful Parks and Rec open space director who's found that when the lights are used, they are dark sky compliant. They purchase dark sky compliant lights, and they were made so that they can be turned off by phone. They have timers on them, so they automatically go off. And the staff has on their cell phones, they can turn them off when they're not being used. So it's too bad to have lighting, but if it is, at least that's a step towards making them more insect friendly and night sky friendly.
100%. And something I just want to emphasize, because I think it's easy to get caught up in this color question in particular. So I want to also clarify that when we talk about the lighting in a public space in a town, so a street, a town square, what have you, you're always going to need some amount of lighting, and the guidelines put out by Dark Sky International are really good. The sort of warmer color, shielding, timing, dimming, all that stuff is really good. I live on the margins of these spaces, right? In these parks, natural areas that are adjacent to human development. And in these natural areas, to some extent, your backyard or front yard counts as one of these on a small scale, but certainly parks, forests, vacation homes. In those areas, you have to be really, really careful. And so in those areas, I advocate being a little bit more extreme. And those are the guidelines that I talk about at the end of this talk and that are in the worksheet, where it's like really like removing unnecessary lights as much as possible and really focusing on motion detectors and making it as dark as possible, because that's where you're going to have the most impact on the environment.
Okay. Somebody notes, lots of people think that less insects is good. They've been happy with the decline. We just
Yeah.
have to send them a link to your recording.
No, I mean, I do get it. And, I didn't like bugs either when I was a kid, actually. I thought they were gross. So I've been there. Um, Two things. If you don't like insects, you shouldn't have lights in your house because they're attracting all the insects. So if you want to see fewer of them, turn out your lights. And two, insects are a really important part of the ecosystem. I talked about how they pollinate, but they do something even more important than that, which is that they turn plants into protein and they feed the birds that we like. They feed birds, they feed bats, they feed frogs. They're the primary diet of a lot of these larger, more charismatic animals. And so if we don't have insects, we don't have those. And so, yeah, we want to keep them around for that reason, as well as pollination and because they're cool.
As you've amply shown.
Mm.
So we have two more questions about color. Color seems to still be of interest to people. And one note is that Dark Sky wants to change the streetlights to be amber. And another is saying, so what color light should people have in their front light that they leave on when they're expecting someone? She says, I heard yellow, but now.
Yeah, light. So light is a spectrum, it's a rainbow. And so when I say the redder the better, I'm talking about the rainbow. It goes, violet, blue, green, yellow, orange, red. So the closer we get to red, the better we are. There is this one exception, which is that orange and yellow in particular are really bad for fireflies. So in firefly habitats, you can actually, blue light's okay, but we don't recommend that for other reasons. So red light is really the best option. And yeah, the best option by far. But, we're talking more like neighborhoods, public spaces. We don't need to be quite as strict. And I think actually, I think I have a fun sort of so this is like the dream. This is a bat reserve in the Netherlands, where these lights have been designed to be bat friendly. So they're super dim, they're super red, they're super shielded. And of course, they've sort of failed the first test, though, in that they're on and nobody's there. So, but assuming somebody was there, these are what we consider like the gold standard in lighting. But this is like we're so far away from this that we don't need to waste time like hemming and
Right.
hawing about the details of this. We need the stuff that Dark Sky recommends, shielding, a little bit warmer, timers, motion detectors, that kind of stuff.
Okay. This has been just astonishing. People seem really appreciative of what you've done. And most of all, thank you, Avalon. This was just magnificent. Thank you so much for all you taught us and the delights you showed us along the way.
Totally. Thank you for having me. This has been really fun.
Good night, everyone. Hope to see you soon.
Good night.